Chapter 16. Seashells on the sea floor.
"Left a bit," Abrian said, looking between the compass and the sextant. "Right a bit." He tilted his head in the direction of the lookout point.
"Wait, which way is left?"
Annie said, scratching her head.
"Is it that way or this way?" "The way you're looking. It's towards me,"
said Dominator.
"To you?"
Annie replied, more confused.
"I swear, if you two don't shut up,"
Morphea grumbled, glaring at them both. It had been 7 days since they had left Tengasharu, and, finally, they were on the patch of sea where they all believed they would find the mermaid scales. Abrian had been calculating strange measurements for 2 days straight. Tepid stood near the forecastle, observing their work with rapt attention while he bounced on his heels.
"So, why do I have to do this again?"
Chie said, hovering as best he could beside Abrian as the ship slowly moved back and forth to accommodate the failed notion's vague instructions.
"Left!"
Abrian shouted up to the lookout point.
"Because you're the only one who can't get hurt or wet, Chie, and we can't see what's down there."
"Great, so I'm the test subject,"
Chie said, rolling his eyes.
"I don't mind, but Delilah said—"
"Pretty much,"
Abrian interrupted him as everything lined up.
"Right, stop!"
he suddenly shouted. Anchors were dropped at both ends of the ship, forcing it to a standstill. The abrupt stop sent Annie and Dominator flying across the deck, while EA suddenly found himself literally nose-deep inside his book.
"That makes me feel so much better,"
said EA sarcastically, trying not to giggle at his brother, who was picking himself up and grumbling after his sudden nose-slide.
"Chie, you're the only one who can do this," said Abrian. "I wouldn't ask you to do it if I didn't think it was right. Besides, if anything goes wrong, you can float out quickly. If one of us were to go down, we would only have our magic and—"
All right, I get it,"
Chie cut Abrian off. He wasn't overly keen on the idea of diving into mermaid territory, but he knew that Abrian was right.
"So I go in, you track the steam for the first few 100 feet, and then you think eventually that will stop and then he's on his own."
Delilah's voice came from behind them. She had a look on her face that Chie recognised as her
"For reasons I don't fully understand, I thoroughly dislike what you're going to do"
expression. He had seen her do it once before, when he had decided to see how long he could hide in the moat without anyone noticing. The joke had worn off by the 4th day, when Annie began building a shrine in his memory.
"I'll be fine, Deli. Don't make promises you can't keep, GA. Just try to get back to us in one piece."
Delilah wanted to scold him for agreeing to do this. She wanted to stop him from going. She wanted to grab hold of him and not let go. But she couldn't. Chie paused. He floated over to her and put his forehead to hers. It was the closest thing they could do to an affectionate touch now, even if neither could feel it. He watched her breathe and try to float in sync with its rise and fall. He was always grateful that although they couldn't touch, she was always there.
"I have to go, Mogra,"
Chie whispered, gently pulling away. Delilah took a deep breath and looked into his eyes.
"I know,"
she said gently, before snapping a glare over to Abrian.
"If anything happens to him, you'll have me and my mother to answer to when we get home."
Abrian visibly shuddered and nodded his head frantically. He didn't much enjoy the idea of the White Queen being angry with him, having seen the fear she struck into the Nether Watchers. Chie floated slowly over the water's surface, carefully looking back at the ship every few feet as Abrian had demanded. Abrian fervently scribbled notes. Annie and Dominator observed on tippy toes. EA leaned on the rail reading his book again, while Morphea peered over the side of the ship along with Delilah, who watched closely. Chie continued down until he reached the crest of the waters. The seafoam green water rose and sank, the waves coming up almost as if they were trying to greet an old friend or a lost relative. Slowly sinking further, he let his tail touch the water, and a column of steam rose up, which grew the more he submerged himself. He could just about hear Abrian's moment of celebration before he was whacked by someone to shut up. Probably Hono. When Chie's head was finally under the water's surface, he began to scan the seafloor for the scales Maemia had told them they would need. Mermaids belonged to the ocean, so, to some extent, their scales provided camouflage. But they weren't impossible to see due to the range of colours. If he was lucky, maybe a black-finned mermaid had just shed some, making it easy for him. Diving deeper, he could see the sea floor and the topography around him. It was extremely deep and mostly sandy, unsurprisingly, although interrupted by a tall underwater cliff rising up from the seabed. Misty blue in the gloom, its highest point was not far below the surface. As Bligh glided closer, to his great surprise he saw, wedged into the cliff, what had once been an ornate ship. It wasn't Nausian in design like theirs. In fact, judging by the carvings, it was just like the ones he'd seen on Maemia's island. Bligh could make out familiar, large, authentic-looking designs on the masts and a hull plated in gold. The large, dark crack in the rock where it was lodged upside down had been carved out by something to make a crevice. Skirting around the sea floor, Bligh wasn't sure now if they were in the right place. For all of Adrian's measurements, he couldn't see any scales. Clack! His tail had whipped through the sand and knocked something over. But how? He was still a ghost after all. On closer inspection, he found it was a pile of sandy and grey-coloured mermaid scales. No wonder he hadn't been able to see them. Tentatively reaching over, he stroked the smooth surface of one of them, and found he could touch it. Like the old red stones he once used, these mermaid scales were brimming with colourful magic. Bligh could feel it seeping into him like a bubbling current, igniting the dormant red magic within him. He almost laughed as glittering wisps of red drifted from his hand as he waved it through the water.
Well, what do you know?
He picked a scale up and examined it. He knew mermaids were magical beings like him, but he hadn't expected their scales to be that magical. This was great news. Maybe he could collect several scales and save the others a trip. However, looking up towards the ship, he knew Delilah would kill him if he did this. Still, it was a better idea than his living friends risking their lives. And hey, he thought to himself, he could be useful for once. Back on the boat, Delilah was still watching over the side. Bligh had gone too far down for her to see, but she felt she had to watch, just in case. Of what exactly, she wasn't sure. The others had already walked away, all except EA, still reading his book. The two of them stayed there in silence for a while. Delilah got the nagging feeling she should say something. She didn't know what, though, as she didn't really know EA very well. Maybe this was her chance to get to know him a little better.
Hey, EA?
Delilah began, looking over at the massive jumper and eyebrows sat next to her. He responded by looking up slightly from his book.
What are you reading?
Necrominacetemy and Mortality by Morai MFX, EA said, with a little sigh. The thick book with its dark blue cover looked as if it was full of big words and complicated ideas. Delilah wasn't sure if she'd dare ask EA what it was about.
Is it, interesting?
Very,
he responded quietly. Delilah realised how bad she was at small talk. Or maybe EA just didn't want to talk to her. Staring back down into the darkness of the water, she let out a small, wistful sigh. If Bligh was here, he would be cracking jokes or saying something interesting.
Hey, do you think he'll be all right?
Delilah heard the big book close with a small thud. Looking over, she saw EA was now looking straight back at her. You know my brother. He's got into plenty of trouble before. No matter what's happened, he's been all right. But he trailed off slightly.
But?
I can't help but worry, EA admitted, looking down at the heavy book and tracing one of the corners with his index finger. He's my little twin brother, and yet I couldn't stop him from being taken advantage of by Key, even when we were alive and stuck together. What kind of brother does that make me?
Delilah looked at EA for a while, trying to understand where he was coming from. She hadn't regained all her memories even now, and was still trying to understand how she should relate to Evelou as a big sister.
I think you're a good big brother,
Delilah said as firmly as she could. EA looked up with an expression that seemed both surprised and thoroughly unconvinced.
I mean, you couldn't stop him from doing what he did, But you forgave him and you still love him. The fact you still love him, even though you weren't happy with his actions, mean that you're a good big brother. At least to me.
The pair looked at each other for a little while. Delilah suddenly felt unsure of herself and her choice of words. Had she upset EA? Had she said something wrong? "Thank you," he said eventually. "That means a lot coming from you." Dominator had been watching this interaction from behind the main mast. He turned away from them and put his chin in his hand thoughtfully. This wasn't the Delilah he had known from before the war.
"Interesting folks, aren't they?"
Dominator jumped. Tepid was leaning on the other side of the mast, also listening to EA and Delilah.
Don't eavesdrop, Tepid. It's rude.
"I was doing no such thing," remarked Tepid. "I simply find observing silently very diverting."
Kie swept up the discarded mermaid scales from the seabed.
Well, that was easy,
he thought sceptically. He looked around to make sure he hadn't missed some massive sea monster, or an enraged mermaid who had just achieved the correct feng shui of the sea by placing the pile of scales there. Nothing. Not even a guppy. Kie shrugged to himself. He remembered from the stories his mother told him that the sea was not meant to be empty. It was full of life, even in the shallow places where there were little crabs and tiny fish that nibble your toes. But down here, apart from the current, nothing was moving. Kie was turning towards the surface when he saw a light coming from the abandoned, upside-down ship. Intrigued, he dipped back down again and made towards the wrecked ship. As he drew closer, Kie noticed the space around him was deafeningly quiet. He couldn't even hear the sound of the waves anymore. Drawing nearer, he could see the light wasn't people-made. It was coming from something in the ship, or rather, under it. Before him was a large, blue-grey amorphous blob of what looked like sinew and flesh. Just below where the light was emanating from, he could make out a face with a pair of closed eyes and a mouth. The creature was sleeping by the looks of it. Still closer, he could see that around it lay fish bones and crab shells. Kie decided not to annoy this thing and turned to float away. But he couldn't. He was stuck. He looked down and saw tiny tentacles wrapped around his tail. One of them was working its way up to his arms, presumably to take the scales. With his free hand, he took one of the scales and struck the nest of tentacles at the base. The thing woke up with a yelp.
"Oh my, what was that for? Oh, depressing, what are you all doing? Get back here."
The monster grumbled, and the mass of tentacles writhed and recoiled back, revealing themselves to be attached to a longer, thicker tentacle.
I do apologize. These things have a mind of their own.
Kie stared in awe, trying to decipher the monster's strange accent.
Let me introduce myself. My name is Chroniese Pin. These are my babies.
The strange monster lifted her tentacles to reveal how they split off into even smaller feelers. Kie found them hard to look at.
You've met Depressy. This is Ames, Stilt, Mini Pin, Brian Mist, and this is Little Reese Virgil. She is a sweetie.
Kie did not feel comfortable being here at all.
It was lovely to meet you and your babies,
He said.
but I really must be
One of the baby tentacles had wrapped itself around his waist and was squeezing him tight.
I'm afraid I cannot let you do that, young sir.
The monster said.
Please come back. I want to smell you. You see, we've been down here waiting an awfully long time.
She grinned widely, displaying row upon row of sharp teeth spiralling towards the back of her mouth, as well as a tongue that split in two. Above its mouth more eyes opened. The leftmost eye was a dark crimson red. The next one along was a bright, blazing orange, followed by a lurid yellow one, then a sapphire blue, and finally there was the rightmost eye, the smallest, which was a sharp purple colour. Gina struggled, suddenly filled with panic. The thing only giggled.
Oh, sweetie, why do you look so blue?
Covering all but the blue eye with her tentacles, Chronie's pins sent a shock of seething energy down Depressi and into Gina. Before he could react, he was enveloped in darkness. Abrian walked up onto the deck and found EA and Delilah resting against the railing, standing next to each other. He had come up to see if Gina was back yet, but as they were both still there, he assumed he wasn't and turned to head back to his cabin.
What is that?
Delilah suddenly shrieked, nearly pushing herself over the rail as a bright blue glow erupted beneath the sea.
Is that magic?
Said EA, confused. Rushing over to them, Abrian tried to take a look, but the light was gone almost as soon as it had appeared.
Gina uses red magic. That couldn't have been him, right?
Delilah asked.
No, but it wouldn't surprise me if he's upset one of the locals somehow, EA said, almost sarcastically.
Almost.
I'd better go in and have a look, Abrian said, preparing to engage his element and jump in.
Then red and purple lights erupted from the depths.
What the...
That'll be the demon that lives below,
Bligh said, walking over.
We heard about some shipwrecks recently. Reckon it must be some sort of monster. Maybe our ghost gave it a fright.
I told you, that's just an old wives' tale,
Abrian insisted as a yellow light blasted up from the seabed.
Does that look like an old wives' tale to you?
The sailor replied. EA and Delilah looked anxiously to where the lights were coming from. EA was gripping the rail so hard he was practically pulling splinters from it. Was he really just going to leave Gina in danger again?
No.
Excuse me, EA?
Delilah asked. But before she could register what was going on, he had already jumped over the side and plummeted towards the water.
EA, no!
Abrian shouted after him, but he was answered by a loud splash. Panicking, he turned desperately to the captain, who stood nearby, watching with his arms folded.
Fail notions aren't worth stopping when they're set on something stupid,
he said firmly. The bursts of magic continued to flash beneath the water. Waves started churning. Abrian stared imploringly at the captain, willing him to realise this was not one of their usual mistakes. Something was going horribly wrong. Oola shook his head in despair.
Oh, all right. Weigh anchor and bring the ship about,
he ordered.
Help the ghost!
Enveloped in a dark cloud, Gina found his body racked with a pain he'd never felt before. He could just about move, but the pain was unbearable. Even thinking was difficult.
Gina?
Delilah's voice slowly drifted towards him from somewhere within the space around him.
Deli...
Gina winced. Talking was too painful.
Oh, Gina, what happened?
Delilah said sadly. She sounded strange, distorted.
You knew I didn't want this, and yet you still did it.
I'm sorry,
Gina thought.
Why?
Delilah's voice was becoming increasingly upset.
Delilah, where are you? Let me see you. I want to say I'm sorry.
Gina thought furiously, hoping beyond hope his thoughts would reach his beloved.
Why are you always so stupid?
Her voice was angry now.
What?
You always do this. You do things without thinking. And worst of all, you make decisions without thinking about me.
No, that's not true. Everything I've done for you. Ah!
Another round of pain ripped through his body, feeling like knives plunging into him over and over again.
And what about your brother? Don't you think about how much you hurt him? You're so impulsive and childish. You've been hurting us both.
No, I don't want to.
It's only about what you want. You never even asked me if I wanted to be brought back from the dead.
Delilah.
And you brought me back without memories. Do you know how hard it's been for me? How hard it is to just have been dropped into a world I don't remember?
Magra.
The world around Hiei went black. It took an awful lot of magical energy to knock out a ghost, but Chroniese Pin had done this before. Letting out a little chuckle, she allowed Angs and Minipin to slither up his body and wrap themselves around his head. She liked to play with her food. Hiei found himself in an off-white room, sat at a very long wooden table with many chairs along its sides. His head was spinning, and his long, brown hair felt extremely heavy, his body weak from pain. He was splintering in and out of consciousness. The only thing he knew was real was the burning he felt. Taking a deep breath, he leaned back in the chair, trying to centre himself and not let his mind spin back into the pain. Blinking, he felt his eyes adjust and realised he was solid. At least in this world, wherever he was. Taking deeper breaths, he began to feel the acrid pain fall away. Back with the living now, are you? Hiei's head snapped up to face the new voice, and a jolt of pain shot through his neck. Ah! He gasped, then relaxed again to lessen the pain. Be careful, you aren't out of the woods yet, my dear, the voice across the room said before laughing. Although I guess that's a redundant saying to a failed notion.
Who are you?
Hiei said. His eyes refused to focus properly. Near to the end of the table, a shadowy figure chuckled some more. My, Chroniese Pin has really done a number on you. Finally, Hiei's vision cleared, and he looked to where, now closer to him, a horribly familiar figure sat.
You...
Don't panic, I'm still dead, the Witch of Glass Mountain said calmly. I'm actually here to help for once. Hiei tried to spit out a response, but stopped as he realised the table was shrinking. The whole scene shimmered, flickering between light and dark. Hiei saw his skin blurring between shades of flesh and blue. The image of the witch, her shaven head, the light behind her pink eyes, kept shaking in and out of focus, disappearing, then reappearing, always coming closer towards him. Don't panic, but she's trying to eat you. Now, I'm going to have to throw some exposition at you to make this make sense, so please try and keep up.
Exposition? What?
No time. I need you to stay alive and not inside a spirit eater's stomach. Hiei could scarcely speak, gripped by fear of the witch in front of him and still racked with the searing pain. The witch seemed to be growing impatient. Oh, do try and pay attention, my dear ghost. If you let the spirit eater consume you, you will be trapped inside her forever. You will lose all sense of yourself. You lose your form, your mind, your memories. Do I need to go on? Hiei stared with wide, frightened eyes. The witch smiled. At last he was paying attention. I'm going to need you to wake up and flood her with magic.
Why?
Because that will make her susceptible to her own magic. And a mind manipulator like this spirit eater has very powerful magic, as you've noticed.
No, I meant, why do you need me alive? I'm dead? I'm a ghost.
Oh, I'm not real. I'm just that part of you stuck in the past.
That wasn't what you're...
But the witch cut across Hiei, ignoring his questions. Again, no time. I just need you to get to work here, all right?
None of this makes any sense.
Life doesn't make sense, nor does death. Now wake up before she eats you. Hiei felt his sight blurring again, then the pain was coming back tenfold. The witch grinned. Say hello to the little ones for me. Gina felt something wrench him backwards, pulling him away from the strange vision. Before he could register that last comment from the witch, the cloud had dissipated entirely. Vaguely aware he was a ghost again, he was trapped in a nest of writhing, dark tentacles. But someone else was there too, tugging them apart, trying to get him out. Suddenly he was moving up, EA pulling him by the tentacle named Depressi, still taut around his waist, towards the surface. Chroniese pin screamed behind them, but the monster hadn't released Gina just yet.
Eldred?
EA shook his head, tugging upwards frantically as if to say, "Don't question, get out of here!" Gina was being nagged again, but it reminded him of what he needed to do. He felt the scales, still clutched in his hand, saw the fizz of red magic coming from his fingers. With all his strength he focused his magic around his head and on the remaining tentacles. A red glow shone between them as if they were burning. Chroniese pin hissed loudly and finally let Gina go. Both brothers swam towards the wobbling outline of the ship. They could see shapes moving on it, but then bright, magical fire shot up from beneath them, singeing the ends of EA's hair. Before they knew what was happening, someone fell from the ship, a crimson ribbon of liquid spilling from an opened wound on their chest. As the figure sank past the brothers, Oola's glassy eyes seemed to stare at them as he fell deeper and deeper into the water. Before EA could reach him, Chroniese pin's tentacles reached up to get there first. "No!" Gina screeched as Dominator's chain, conjured from blazing orange magic, flew past him towards the beast. With Abrian close behind, Dominator slowly sank through the water. More chains fired past, pinning Chroniese pin and her babies down. "Hurry up, you two! Go!" Abrian mouthed, speeding past in his watery elemental form towards the Spirit Eater. Tearing their eyes away, Gina and EA headed towards the surface, but EA could feel himself slowing. Water was seeping through his stitches and weighing him down. Gina could see the shape of the ship just above them, trembling through the waves. There was a shriek of frustration from below. Chroniese pin had broken out of the onslaught of magic, sending Abrian and Dominator spinning in opposite directions. The furious tentacles exploded upwards, and one shot through the confusion and seized Gina round the head. Somewhere in the chaos, a vicious grin spread across Chroniese's face as she sent a blazing light along the tentacle. Flaring around Gina, it wrenched him backwards. He felt as if his head was being pulled off. Everything was on fire in a catastrophic, burning pain. He couldn't see. He couldn't think. Chroniese pin's eyes shone with a determined hunger as she dragged him down, even as Dominator hacked at her remaining arms with his magic. Then a new light broke through the water. Beautiful, pearlescent white light. Its glare shone with a fierceness that blinded the eyes of Chroniese pin. It lifted the agony in Gina's head, melting away the pressure and pain. And suddenly he could see again. Looking down, he saw the shredded remains of the tentacle falling away. It was Chroniese pin's turn to feel pain now, and she did not like it. The water had taken its toll on EA, but the white magic reached down to him, weaving itself into thick, glittering cords of light which gripped round his arms. Gina reached towards the magic, but his ghostly hand went through it. The howling of the monster below grew louder. He felt so dizzy. The magic glimmered.
"Mogra!"
With a last desperate effort, Gina flew after the white magic and up through the water. Then suddenly there was sky all around him, and with a whirl of masts and ship, everything blurred into confusion. The next thing Gina saw was a pair of brown eyes. He wasn't sure whose, as his vision ebbed in and out of focus.
"You're all right. Oh, you're all right."
Someone was sobbing. Images were growing sharper. Delilah's tear-stained face swam into view, and Gina felt his head clear. White magic spilt from her trembling hands, surrounding him in wonderfully soft light. It was so soothing, easing away the pain. Gina couldn't see what Delilah saw. How ragged he was, his blue glow greying at the edges. How close the escape had been. There were still distant shouts and splashes, but they grew quieter. The world fell away as long as he stayed in that moment with her beside him. Then exhaustion took over, and a blissful, gentle silence surrounded him as he fell unconscious. Down below, Abrion hauled a still irate Dominator to the surface as fast as he could. Considerably depleted, Chroniese screamed her way across the seabed after them. One of her eyes was blackened, her arms tattered versions of their former selves. She wanted revenge. She wanted to destroy them, to shred them to pieces. Abrion and Dominator couldn't swim fast enough. Hot panic flooded through Abrion as the monster caught up, arms grasping towards him. He braced himself for the worst. In the days to come, Abrion tried to describe what happened, but it still felt too unbelievable, too strange. Underneath him, the sea, the sand, the entire image in front of him twisted and an opening appeared, like curtains being drawn backwards. The fabric of reality was being pulled apart. The opening was full of darkness, pitch black except for a pair of small white lights. They looked at the furious beast before them, and then at Abrion. He hung in the water behind Dominator, paralysed with fear as black chains emerged from the darkness. But they weren't for them. Chroniese Pin screamed and flailed as the chains took a firm hold. Her body squirmed and shrank.
You are trespassing on a realm of reality that does not support you,
said the lights, as she was pulled irresistibly into the waiting shadows.
You will be removed.
Chroniese Pin's tattered tentacles thrashed uselessly. With one last howling shriek, she was sucked away, vanishing into the darkness and out of sight. The lights remained for a brief moment and looked directly at Abrion.
Don't say we didn't warn you,
they said.
It's very dangerous to play with reality.
Then the opening shut, leaving nothing but the ocean floor below and the waves lapping above.